Value of Time, a Life-Changing Motivational Story. Step 1. The Precious Gift of Time. There was once a man named Edward who lived in the heart of a bustling city. Edward was a picture of success by societal standards: a mansion in the suburbs, luxury cars in his driveway, and a bank account so full that he couldn't possibly spend all his money in a lifetime. Yet, despite having everything money could buy, Edward often felt a void within. Edward's days were consumed by work meetings, business deals, and endless calls. He was celebrated for his ambition and drive, often working 18-hour days to ensure his empire thrived. But his life felt mechanical, like a machine ticking without a purpose. Deep down, he knew something was missing, though he couldn't quite place what it was. One evening, after yet another exhausting day, Edward decided to take a stroll through the local park, a rare occurrence. The park was a world away from his high-pressure office. Children played on swings, couples laughed together, and the soft rustling of leaves brought a sense of calm. Amidst this lively yet serene setting, Edward's eyes fell on an old man sitting on a wooden bench. The man was dressed in simple, weathered clothes and seemed utterly content. His face bore the lines of age, but his smile radiated a kind of peace Edward hadn't seen in years, not in his colleagues, his employees, or even himself. Curious and inexplicably drawn, Edward approached the old man. "Good evening," Edward began, sitting beside him. The old man smiled warmly. "Good evening, young man. A rare sight to see someone like you here at this hour." Edward chuckled awkwardly. "Someone like me?" The old man nodded. "Busy. Chasing time instead of living it." Edward was taken aback. "What do you mean?" he asked. The old man looked at him thoughtfully. "You wear success on your sleeve, but there's a heaviness in your eyes." "Am I wrong?" Edward hesitated. "No, you're not wrong," he admitted. "But how can you tell?" The old man chuckled softly. "Because I was like you once. I thought wealth would solve everything. I worked day and night, thinking the more I earned, the happier I'd be. But years passed, and instead of happiness, I found exhaustion. One day, I lost someone dear to me, a person I had neglected in my pursuit of success. That's when I realized the truth." Edward leaned forward, intrigued. "And what truth is that?" The old man's expression turned serious. "Time is the most precious currency we have. You can earn money, but you can never buy back lost time. I spent years chasing things that don't matter, and by the time I realized it, much of my life had slipped through my fingers like sand. Now, I spend my days differently." "What do you do differently?" Edward asked, genuinely curious. "I focus on what brings me true fulfillment," the old man replied. "Spending time with loved ones, learning something new, appreciating the beauty of each day. It's not about how much time you have, it's about how you use it." Edward sat in silence, digesting the old man's words. He thought about his own life, his vast wealth, the accolades he'd earned, the empire he'd built. But alongside that came memories of the things he had sacrificed: missed birthdays, skipped vacations, and strained relationships. His younger sister hadn't spoken to him in years, frustrated by his absence from family gatherings. His health had started to falter too, but he dismissed it as the price of ambition. "You look troubled," the old man said gently. Edward nodded. I've never thought of it this way before. I've always believed that time is something you manage, schedule it, optimize it, squeeze the most out of it." The old man smiled knowingly. "That's the trap, my friend. Time is not something you manage. It's something you live. Each moment is a gift, but we're so busy planning for the future that we forget to experience the present. Tell me, when was the last time you felt truly alive?" Edward froze. The question hit him like a ton of bricks. He couldn't remember. The old man patted his shoulder. "It's not too late to change. Start small. Take a moment each day to do something that brings you joy, real joy, not just productivity. Spend time with people who matter to you. Listen to the birds, watch the sunrise, call a friend. Life is in the little things." The old man rose from the bench, preparing to leave. "One last thing," he said, turning to Edward. You're fortunate to have recognized this before it's too late. Many people don't. Use your time wisely, young man. It's the only true wealth you'll ever have. Edward watched as the old man walked away, disappearing into the dusky light. He felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity. That night, he went home and sat in silence, reflecting on his life. He thought of all the moments he had let slip by unnoticed, the laughter he hadn't joined, the adventures he had postponed, the people he had neglected. The next morning, Edward made a decision. He cancelled his meetings for the day and drove to his sister's house, surprising her with a bouquet of her favorite flowers. At first, she was skeptical, but as they talked, Edward shared his realization and apologized for the years he had been absent. Slowly, the icy barrier between them melted. Over the next few weeks, Edward began to make changes. He started working fewer hours, delegating responsibilities to his team. He took up painting, a hobby he had loved as a child but abandoned in the rush to build his career. He spent weekends hiking with friends and made it a point to call his sister every week. Though his income shrank slightly, Edward felt richer than ever. The void he once felt began to fill with a sense of purpose and contentment. For the first time in years, he wasn't just alive, he was living. One evening, as Edward watched the sunset from his balcony, he thought of the old man in the park. He never saw him again, but his words echoed in Edward's mind, "Time is the most precious currency." Edward smiled, grateful for the lesson that had transformed his life. From that day forward, he made a promise to himself, to never take time for granted and to spend it on what truly mattered. This version elaborates on Edward's transformation and the deep impact of the old man's wisdom, making it a richer and more engaging narrative. Step 2. The Clockmaker's Wisdom. In a quaint village nestled at the edge of a sprawling forest, there lived a renowned clockmaker named Mr. Alden. Known far and wide for his extraordinary craftsmanship, his clocks were not only accurate but also works of art, adorned with intricate carvings and delicate details. It was said that every clock he created held a story, a lesson hidden in its gears and hands. One day, a young man named Thomas arrived at Mr. Alden's shop. Thomas was restless and filled with a sense of urgency. He had just turned 25 and felt he was running out of time to achieve the success he dreamed of. He had tried various ventures, but nothing seemed to fulfill him. Frustrated, he sought out the clockmaker, hoping to learn the secret of managing time. As Thomas entered the shop, he was greeted by the rhythmic ticking of countless clocks lining the walls. Some were grand and ornate, while others were simple and modest. The air was filled with a calm yet powerful energy, as if time itself was alive in the room. Mr. Alden, a kind man with silver hair and wise eyes, looked up from his workbench and smiled. "Welcome, young man. What brings you here today?" Thomas hesitated, unsure how to begin. "I've heard you're not just a clockmaker but a keeper of wisdom. People say you understand time better than anyone else. I've come to ask you, how can I make the most of my time?" Mr. Alden studied the young man for a moment and then gestured to a beautiful clock on his workbench. It was a masterpiece, its golden hands gliding smoothly over an ivory face, framed by intricate carvings of leaves and stars. "This clock," Mr. Alden began, "is not just a tool for telling time. It's a reminder that each second, minute, and hour is an opportunity." Thomas furrowed his brow. "An opportunity for what?" "For whatever you choose," the clockmaker replied. "But tell me, Thomas, why do you feel you're running out of time?" Thomas sighed. "I see people my age achieving so much, building careers, making money, traveling the world. I feel like I'm falling behind. No matter how hard I try, I can't seem to catch up. It feels like time is slipping away, and I'm wasting it." Mr. Alden nodded thoughtfully. "I see. Let me show you something." He led Thomas to a large grandfather clock standing in the corner of the shop. Its pendulum swung steadily, each tick and tock resonating deeply. "Listen to this clock," Mr. Alden said. "Each tick is a second passing. Do you hear how steady it is? Time doesn't rush or pause, it moves at its own pace, unchanging and unyielding. The secret to making the most of time isn't about rushing to fill every second, it's about understanding the rhythm and using it wisely." Thomas looked at the clock, perplexed. But how can I make every second count? Mr. Alden smiled and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. Ah, that's the trap many fall into. You see, it's not about filling every moment with action but about filling your moments with meaning. Let me tell you a story. He led Thomas to a small table, poured them each a cup of tea, and began. The Clockmaker's Tale. Years ago, I was much like you, Mr. Alden said. Eager to make my mark on the world, I worked day and night crafting clocks. I took pride in my skill and believed that the more clocks I made, the more successful I would be. But one day, a wealthy merchant visited my shop and asked me to create a clock unlike any other, a clock that would teach him the value of time. At first, I was confused. I thought, isn't every clock a reminder of time's value? But the merchant insisted there was more to it. So, I spent weeks working on his request. I created a clock with two special features. First, its face had 12 golden words instead of numbers: family, friends, health, work, nature, rest, play, learning, giving, gratitude, reflection, and love. Second, the clock had a mechanism that chimed differently depending on how the user spent their time. When the merchant spent his hours meaningfully helping others, nurturing relationships, or learning, the clock played a harmonious melody. But when he wasted his time on trivial pursuits or harmful habits, the chime was discordant and unpleasant. When I delivered the clock, the merchant was moved to tears. He realized he had been so focused on accumulating wealth that he had neglected the things that truly mattered. Over time, he changed his ways and began living a more balanced and meaningful life. A lesson for Thomas. Thomas listened intently, captivated by the story. So, what happened to the merchant? He asked. Mr. Alden smiled. He became a happier man. Not because he earned more money or achieved more accolades, but because he learned to align his time with his values. That's the key, Thomas. Time is a resource we all have in equal measure, but how we use it determines our true success. Thomas sat in silence, pondering the clockmaker's words. But how do I know if I'm using my time wisely? Mr. Alden stood and walked to a nearby shelf, retrieving a small, simple clock. He handed it to Thomas. This is my gift to you, he said. Every night before you sleep, look at this clock and ask yourself 3 questions. What did I do today that brought me joy? What did I do to help others? What did I learn? If you can answer these questions with honesty and satisfaction, then you're using your time well. Thomas took the clock, feeling a strange sense of clarity. Thank you, Mr. Alden. I'll try to live by your advice. As he left the shop, the rhythmic ticking of the clock seemed to echo in his mind, a reminder of the lesson he had just learned. Over the following weeks, Thomas began to shift his focus. Instead of worrying about accomplishments, he started prioritizing meaningful activities, spending time with loved ones, pursuing his passions, and giving back to his community. Though he still had ambitions, he no longer felt the suffocating pressure to achieve them all at once. He understood that success wasn't about how much he did, but about the quality of his experiences and the impact he made. Years later, Thomas returned to the village to thank Mr. Alden. But when he arrived at the clockmaker's shop, he found it closed. A neighbor told him that Mr. Alden had passed away, leaving behind a legacy of wisdom that touched countless lives. As Thomas looked at the clock Mr. Alden had given him, he smiled, remembering the lesson that had changed his life. The final reflection. From that day forward, Thomas lived with a newfound appreciation for time. He embraced its rhythm, filled his moments with meaning, and carried the clockmaker's wisdom in his heart. The world around him didn't slow down, but his perspective had changed. Time was no longer an enemy to be conquered but a gift to be cherished. The clockmaker's words echoed in his mind: be intentional with your time, for you can never get it back. And so, Thomas lived not just for the ticking of the clock, but for the harmony of a life well spent. This expanded version provides more depth to the story, emphasizing its lessons through vivid imagery, a reflective tale within a tale, and a transformative journey for the protagonist. Step 3. The last day. James woke up to a peculiar sensation. It wasn't a sharp pain or a startling noise but a deep, unshakable feeling in his chest. Lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling, trying to decipher what was bothering him. Then, it hit him, the thought that this might be his last day on Earth. James wasn't the sort to dwell on existential thoughts. He was a middle-aged accountant with a busy schedule, a family to care for, and deadlines constantly looming over him. Life for James had always been about routines and responsibilities. Yet, as he sat up in bed, the weight of his realization pressed down on him: if today were my last day, how would I live it? This question lingered as James prepared for the day. He poured himself a cup of coffee, but even the familiar aroma didn't bring him the usual comfort. Instead, his mind wandered to the days that had slipped by unnoticed, days spent hunched over his desk, rushing from task to task, too preoccupied to appreciate the world around him. A morning of new eyes. As James stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper, something unusual happened. He paused. The world, which he usually saw in fragments, brief glimpses between hurried moments, appeared different. The sun's rays filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the driveway. The air was crisp and carried the scent of freshly cut grass. A bird perched on a nearby branch chirped melodiously, as if welcoming him to the day. For the first time in years, James didn't rush back inside. He stood there, absorbing the scene. The ordinary suddenly felt extraordinary. Reconnecting with family. Back inside, his wife, Clara, was preparing breakfast while their teenage daughter, Emma, scrolled through her phone at the table. Typically, James would greet them with a quick nod before diving into emails. But today was different. He walked over to Clara, kissed her cheek, and said, "Good morning." "That smells amazing." Clara looked at him, surprised. "Good morning to you too. You're in a good mood today." "I just realized how long it's been since I really stopped to enjoy mornings like this," James replied. Emma looked up from her phone, raising an eyebrow. "Are you feeling okay, Dad?" James chuckled. "I'm fine, sweetheart. But I've been thinking, how about we have dinner together tonight? No phones, just the three of us. I want to hear about your day." Emma smiled faintly. "Sure, Dad. That sounds nice." Savoring the little things. James left for work with a newfound perspective. During his commute, he usually plugged in his headphones and scrolled through news headlines, but today he rolled down the window. The city buzzed with life, vendors calling out their wares, children laughing on their way to school, and cyclists weaving through the traffic. At a stoplight, a stranger crossing the street caught James's attention. The man smiled and nodded in his direction. James hesitated for a moment before smiling back. That brief exchange, simple as it was, filled him with a surprising warmth. When he arrived at the office, James decided to take a break from his usual routine. Instead of diving straight into work, he spent a few minutes chatting with his colleagues. He asked about their families, their weekends, and their hobbies, conversations he had often dismissed as unimportant. One coworker, Rachel, shared a story about her son winning his first soccer game. Another, Daniel, talked about the novel he'd started writing. James realized how much he had missed in the lives of those around him simply because he'd been too focused on his own tasks. A day of reflection. Throughout the day, James found himself reflecting on his choices. He had spent decades working tirelessly to provide for his family, but in doing so, he had often neglected the very people he was working for. He thought about missed school plays, postponed vacations, and the countless times he'd told Clara, "I'll be home late tonight." As the afternoon sun streamed through his office window, James pulled out a notebook and began writing down the things he wanted to change. Spend more time with family. Take a day off to explore nature. Reconnect with old friends. Pursue a hobby, maybe photography or painting. Be present in the moment. The list felt both daunting and liberating. James realized that he didn't need a monumental event to start making changes. He just needed to begin. An evening of togetherness. That evening, true to his promise, James came home early. He helped Clara set the table and even lit a few candles to make dinner feel special. As they sat down, he put his phone in a drawer and encouraged Emma and Clara to do the same. The conversation flowed in a way it hadn't in years. Emma talked about her upcoming school project and her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Clara shared a story about a book she'd been reading, and James listened intently, laughing and chiming in. For the first time in a long while, the house felt alive with warmth and connection. After dinner, James suggested a family walk. They strolled through the neighborhood, pointing out stars in the night sky and reminiscing about old memories. Emma even held James's hand, a small gesture that filled his heart with gratitude. A night of realization. As the day came to an end, James sat alone in the living room, reflecting on the strange feeling that had greeted him that morning. The thought of it being his last day had transformed his perspective, but now he realized that every day held the potential to be meaningful. Looking back, James understood that his greatest regret wasn't tied to his work or achievements but to the moments he had let slip by, the times he had been physically present but emotionally absent, too preoccupied with the future to appreciate the present. Before heading to bed, James wrote one final note in his notebook. Time is fleeting, but its value is infinite. I may not know how many days I have left, but I do know how I want to spend them, cherishing my loved ones, finding joy in the simple things, and living fully in each moment. A life transformed. The next morning, James woke up with a lighter heart. Though the peculiar feeling was gone, its lesson remained. From that day on, he made a conscious effort to live differently. He started waking up earlier to watch the sunrise, savoring the beauty of a new day. At work, he prioritized meaningful connections with his colleagues and took regular breaks to step outside and breathe. Most importantly, James dedicated more time to his family. He and Clara revived their tradition of weekend picnics, and he never missed another one of Emma's school events. Over time, James noticed a profound change in himself. Life didn't feel like a race anymore. It felt like a gift, a series of moments waiting to be embraced. The enduring lesson. Years later, as an older and wiser James sat by the fireplace with Clara, he looked back on his life with no regrets. The day he thought might be his last had been a turning point, teaching him the most valuable lesson of all. Time, once gone, can never be reclaimed. But while it's here, it holds the power to transform our lives if we choose to spend it wisely. This expanded story highlights the transformative power of appreciating life's fleeting moments and underscores the importance of living in the present.